Well, hello. Round two, and I'll hop right into it. Let's see here if I can start this. And if this button will work. You now see before you my greatest favorite of the feathered tribes of our woods. To it I owe much. How often has it revived my drooping spirit when I have listened to its wild notes in the forest? As the first glimpses of morning gleamed doubtfully amongst the dusky masses of forest trees, has there come upon my ear the delightful music of this harbinger of day. The words of John James Audubon could not have put it better as we welcome back our feathered friend back to the hardwood forests of Pennsylvania this spring. And this harbinger of day will be the focus of my talk today as we dive into the topic of mature forest management. Who here in the room detected a wood thrush this weekend so far? There we go. So this talk is applicable to all. So we're going to begin today's talk with an overview of wood thrush, its biology and ecology, and then we'll dive into a discussion of some insights into the habitat selection of wood thrush that I gained from my master's research here at Penn State. And then we're going to pivot that discussion into a talk about forest management in Pennsylvania and some particular challenges in mature forest management, which will set us up to discuss some of the opportunities that I call carbon forestry that are available to us nowadays. So I know I do not need to remind this room that we are in the midst of a huge loss in terms of abundance of North American birds. The research from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology estimates that almost 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. Approximately 170 million of those are eastern forest birds during that 50-year period. So while there has been about a 17% loss in eastern forest bird populations, the wood thrush is an example of a species whose population decline has been as steep as 60%. That said, fortunately, there is some hope in the recently released 2022 State of the Birds report released from the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. Although their report estimates roughly a 30% loss in overall population since 1970, the curve has actually been straightening out in the past decade for eastern forest bird populations. Oh, yes. There we go. And so the cerulean warbler, which was detected this weekend, that is a favorite of mine, estimated to have declined nearly 70%. Their declines have actually slowed to about 1/3% per year, while the wood thrush itself has actually seen a slight increase of around 0.7% per year. So this is really heartening news, and the report specifically credits some of the collaborative partnerships that Audubon has been a part of as a key ingredient to the solution. So why wood thrush and why Pennsylvania? Now we're going to keep testing our technological skills, and we're going to try this guy. Look at that. Isn't that neat? Well, here in the Commonwealth, we support about 10% of the global population of wood thrush during the breeding season, which means that our state, in terms of forest management, has one of the largest impacts on the breeding success of this population at a global scale. So as you can see in the trend map on the left of the screen, wood thrush are actually contracting in the northeast portion of their range, but their populations are relatively stable in the western portion of Pennsylvania. So overall, this reflects that there's something going on in our landscape where wood thrush are generally not doing well, especially during the breeding season in the eastern portions of the state, but there's something about those western portions of the state where they're being more successful. And we're going to get into that a little bit more further on in this talk. So the wood thrush itself is a very charismatic species. Many of you I know have just seen it because you raised your hands. It is a medium-bodied thrush that lives in these mid to late successional mesic or somewhat moist hardwood forests. It forages in deep leaf litter on the ground. I'm sure many of you have been seeing it hopping around, which is kind of unique. It nests in understory, mid-story saplings and shrubs about 2-3 meters off the ground. It forms this very conspicuous cup-like nest, and it's considered an umbrella species oftentimes. So a lot of times it is a focal species or a species that is managed for because the habitat conditions that it inhabits really are great for a whole host of other species. When you think wood thrush habitat, what comes to mind is scarlet tanager, your ovenbirds, red-eyed vireos, Acadian flycatcher. There's that whole group of species that also inhabit these mature hardwood forests. So here during the breeding season, wood thrush face many challenges to breeding successfully. Notably, nest parasitism from brown-headed cowbirds affects the species quite a bit, as well as nest predation. And what's interesting is that these two impacts on the wood thrush are compounded by habitat fragmentation on the landscape and the resulting edge effects that results from the development and cutting of forests. And so this is kind of this compounding effect where not only is fragmentation reducing habitat availability on the landscape, but it's degrading the quality of habitat that we have. So here in the ridge and valley portion of the state, this is the current landscape that we're facing. We have our valleys, which are predominantly inhabited by humans in terms of residential areas, but also agriculture, with small, sporadic, and fragmented woodlots. And then we have our slopes and ridges in primarily contiguous mature forest. And while wood thrush will inhabit both of these areas, as my advisor loves to say, wood thrush are a good bird that makes bad decisions. And so you'll have wood thrush inhabiting these small fragmented woodlots in the valleys, but they're really not doing well. A lot of the literature shows us that these edge effects are causing them to not be successful in their nesting, whether it be nest parasitism or predation. So generation after generation, wood thrush may be using these areas and actually packing into them because they are mature forests. They think it's a good place to go. But what's happening is that they're not successfully nesting. And over time, that's causing declines in the population. On the other hand, in these large contiguous forest blocks, wood thrush are actually doing pretty well. And so what we'd like to do in terms of land managers is increase the density of wood thrush in these large contiguous areas that we know wood thrush have moderately successful nest success. So back to that trend map, I have Pennsylvania roughly denoted here in red. You can see that there's this emerging story occurring on our landscape, where the eastern portion of the state, we're seeing a lot more forest fragmentation, a lot more parcelization of these small woodlots. And while wood thrush may be using them, they're actually not successfully nesting. And over time, that's causing a huge impact on the population. Whereas in the western portion of the state, populations are a lot more stable or actually increasing in some areas. So it's these western portions of the state that are a very important ingredient to the solution. If we know that they're nesting successfully in these areas, what can we do as land managers to make these areas even better for wood thrush? So that takes us to the beginning of my master's research. There has been a huge amount of data already collected on wood thrush, and it was summarized in a paper by Lambert in 2017, and it describes generally where you would expect to find wood thrush. So we're thinking our intermediate to mature hardwood kind of mixed forests. These are these mature, about 100, 120-year-old forests, so tall canopy heights in excess of 50 feet, very dense canopy closure, so anywhere in excess of 80% canopy closure. The basal area is a little bit of a complex measurement. If you were to take a forest and cut every tree off at breast height, then you summed all of the area of that wood together and then represented it per acre. That would be basal area, but it's roughly a measure of the way that we collect it, it's how many stems there are and how much tree there is out there. Generally, the more mature forests are, the more well-stocked they are, the higher the basal area. Tree diameters, they like wide-ranging tree diameters. They do like those large mature trees. And the forest floor needs to be open with that thick leaf litter for them to forage. So this was really helpful, but something that we ran into early on was, well, okay, this gets us into the stand. This tells us what kind of stands you'd expect to find wood thrush in, but it doesn't really tell us what to do if you have wood thrush and you want to make more wood thrush. And so that was really the impetus for our research. And I'm going to give you an overview of kind of our process and some of the insights that we gained into wood thrush habitat selection and the implications for forest management here. So when we think about how wood thrush use Pennsylvania, they are coming back just now and establishing territories. So they're flying back into these forest stands that satisfy those Lambert guidelines. The birds do not have the Lambert guidelines, but they're pretty good at knowing them. The males will actually return before the females, and they'll establish these territories, and they'll duke it out. And that's what we're enjoying right now, those territorial songs. And if you're pretty good at it, they also produce these bweebs and bwubs, which are these very territorial arguments and they'll fly all around and very enthusiastically defend their territories. And so these territories are established, and about 1 to 2 weeks later, females return from onto the breeding grounds, and they're returning to these stands that are now occupied by these male territories. And they shop around, they go on dates, they decide who they want to settle down with, and within that territory, they select a nest site. And they'll come back about 1 to 2 weeks later, which I find very interesting. And so when we're discussing this question of territory selection, okay, what are they selecting for? It's always a comparison of use and availability. So in terms of territory, what is used are the occupied portion of these stands. And then what is available to these birds are the portions of the stand that were available to them, but they decided not to place a territory there. So that comparison of use availability is what we would consider use availability habitat selection. So we compared those occupied and unoccupied portions of the stands to try to get at that question of why are they placing their territories where they are. Similarly, for nest site selection, the used spot is the actual nest site itself. And then when you think about, well, what is available to these females, there are other points within that male's territory because they're making that decision within that territory. And so that comparison of the used and available sites, the nest site and the other available points that they could have placed the nest site in that territory, that gets us at that question of habitat selection. And something I just want to note here is that these aren't necessarily discrete decisions. They might be interrelated. Obviously, if a male is setting up a territory, he'll probably be more successful if he thinks about what the female is going to be looking for. And so these are a little bit nuanced, they're a little bit mixed, but it's important to consider multiple scales whenever you're talking about habitat selection. This is an opportunity where I love to mention a study from Canada that looked at wolves. So these researchers wanted to say, well, hey, what is the relationship between wolves and road density or just roads? And so on a landscape scale, they found that wolves very much like to avoid roads. Generally, roads mean people, and interactions between wolves and people tend to go poorly for the wolves. And so on a landscape scale, wolves were not associated with high road densities. But if they looked within wolf home ranges, they found that wolves were almost exclusively using roads to travel because it was much more energetically efficient for them to walk on roads instead of to bushwhack through the underbrush. And so it's important to take that two different spatial scales to try to understand that question. And so similarly, we looked at territory selection on the stand scales. We looked at, okay, if this is a stand that wood thrush would inhabit, they're making that territory selection on a stand level, whereas nest site selection is a kind of a within territory scale level decision. And so by looking at these two spatial scales, it's giving us more information, which is a really good approach to habitat selection. So fast forwarding to the results, we had a lot of fun doing point counts and nest site searching. And I know some field techs of mine are here and they know how to identify a wood thrush nest in the woods from a half a mile. So on the territory scale, we found that male wood thrush territories had greater amounts of understory cover. So this is that kind of shrubs, saplings in the understory, but they also, as compared to the rest of the stand, and they had less ground cover. So they had more access to the forest floor. And this makes a lot of sense to us based on our understanding of wood thrush ecology. So as I mentioned, wood thrush need nest sites eventually. The males are probably thinking about this. And they're also foraging on the ground. So one of the best things about a territory is that it shows, hey, look, we can provide for these nestlings because we can easily access the forest floor. So this makes sense to us. In terms of nest sites, we found hundreds of nest sites, and they were primarily placed in witch hazel, hemlock, sweet birch, American beech, red maple, white pine. And what you might notice, if you're astute about your ecology, these are shade-tolerant species primarily. These are also species that are not represented in the overstory of an oak, hickory, hardwood forest. So at first we thought, oh my goodness, look, they're making this very unique, interesting decision. And then the forestry professor on my board pointed out that, of course, you wouldn't find witch hazel in the canopy. Also, you wouldn't find any of these in the canopy of an even-aged oak forest. And of course, you wouldn't really find oak at the right height in the understory because we're talking 80% canopy closure. So you're going to have your shade tolerant species. So these are species that are adapted to growing in those lower light conditions. And so this makes a lot of sense to us. A lot of these species also, especially witch hazel and hemlock, have very horizontal branching patterns. And wood thrush nests, as I mentioned, are very large, conspicuous, heavy cup nests. And so they need they really like that horizontal structure to place that nest on it. And it's really cool because as conspicuous as they are, they're very, very close to a clump of leaves. So a dead clump of oak leaves falling and getting caught in a bush looks exactly like a wood thrush nest. So there is a little bit of camouflage there. In terms of how they were placing these nests, what we found was increased amounts of understory and midstory at the nest compared to the rest of the territory. That makes a lot of sense because you need a bush to put a nest in. But then we found lower amounts of basal area and canopy closure. Well, that was a little bit more complex to us. Why? We understand that they nest in these understory saplings and shrubs, but why is it that these kind of more open canopies and fewer tree stems, why is that associated with nest sites? Well, let's take a step back and think ecologically about what's happening with wood thrush in these large, mature, contiguous oak forests. So they're inhabiting these mature forests about 100, 120 years old. And although this is considered an even age system, so a lot of these trees grew up at the same time, as these oak forests approach maturity, they're entering what's called the understory reinitiation phase. And that's something where you have large, old, mature canopy trees. They senesce, they die, and they fall on the ground. And in that resulting gap in the canopy, it's small enough that you're not going to regenerate any of your early successional species or even your oaks, but you're going to regenerate your shade tolerant, your maples, your witch hazels, your hemlocks. And it's in this resulting little tiny gap, this little thicket of vegetation that the nests, the wood thrush are eventually placing their nests. So although this is an even age system, what we found here is that wood thrush are really keying in on these uneven aged processes as these stands start to reach maturity. So wood thrush are really capitalizing on these pockets of forest succession. This is really how they're inhabiting a lot of these even age stands. So what does this mean for forest management in the state? Well, what we wanted to do for the second chapter of my thesis was really look at these insights that we had from nature, what is naturally going on, and see, hey, is this something that we could artificially produce? Is this something that we could make through silvicultural intervention? And so you can see here, we had some game commission staff. They got to have all the fun. They wouldn't let me do it for liability reasons. They dropped a few trees and they created these small gaps. And we're going to be, the goal of this was, can we create these small gaps artificially, see a resulting boom in that little understory vegetation, monitor this into the future, and then see if we actually were able to increase the densities of wood thrush in these stands that we knew that their nest success was already high. So this project is ongoing. One of the benefits to setting up a long-term study is that you can write it as the second chapter of your thesis and then graduate, and then somebody has to do it 10 years from now. So I'm very excited to going back to those sites. This is actually State Game Lands 166. So if you ever get down there, look around, you might see some pretty interesting looking trees. So the technique that we keyed in on for this was these small canopy openings. So about 20 to 30 meters in diameter. And we really wanted to avoid the removal of large marketable trees. So why is that, right? So the example that I provided was you have a large tree, it dies, it falls over, creates the perfect size gap. Well, we end up doing a lot of this in Pennsylvania. It's called high grading, and you really don't want to do it. This is a commercial process where you go into a forest and you take just the perfect, largest, most straight trees, pull them out of there, and then you leave. And the problem is that trees they have genetics, right? So you have, even though you have a forest where a lot of these trees are the same age or very close in age, you have different tree diameters, and a lot of that can be genetically caused. And so if you, over generations, take just the biggest, most healthy trees, you end up with the slower growing, the poorer form, more unhealthy trees. And so you have an understocked stand, you have a stand that grows slower, that isn't as resilient to things like forest pests and disease outbreaks. And so it can be a very damaging practice. So we wanted to make these gaps without doing that. So we did that by removing kind of this smaller diameter, less desirable trees like red maple or trees of poorer form, while leaving some of these large canopy trees. So we created that same size opening to kind of replicate that large canopy disturbance, but taking smaller trees. And we positioned some of these gaps with regeneration in mind. So we wanted to position the gap over an existing patch of witch hazel, or maybe if we found some of those shade tolerant saplings already starting to poke through, we thought if we got some light on them, maybe this would give them a little burst of growth and they would create that little perfect desired thicket condition. We also did what's called coppice growth, which is really cool. This is stump sprouts. So you can go in and you can cut a tree, and if you do it just right, all of the life of that tree is underground. So when it grows the next growing season, it'll pop out a bunch of sprouts from the stump. And we actually made these Dr. Seuss trees, which I really like. That's a black gum there. We cut them about this tall because our biggest issue at our field sites is deer browse. So you can cut it, but a deer is going to come and nibble it, and then it'll be game over. So we thought, well, if we get it up here, we might be able to outpace them. So cut it high, the stump sprouts come out, and boom, you have instant wood thrush nesting substrate. So I'm really excited to go back and see if this works. It's a really goofy looking thing. Unfortunately, black gum isn't a marketable species, so nobody's going to mind if it's a little Dr. Seuss looking. And so this was the technique that we came up with. So what can we offer habitat managers? Well, we know that structural complexity is very important in forests. Species diversity, structural diversity is really important for issues like resiliency. You want to avoid monocultures in a forest. You want to have that diversity, not just for forest health, but for the health of the birds. It supports more forest bird species. We also know that creating small gaps can promote some of these shade tolerant species that wood thrush really like to nest in. But the big question at the end of the day is there interest in management like this? We can come up with this, but if nobody's going to do it, it doesn't really matter. Well, in Pennsylvania, of the 17 million acres almost that we have of forest land, about 70% of it is privately owned. And in 2014, the USDA did a survey of woodland owners to see their perceptions on forest management. And only 21% of private forest owners felt that timber production was an important reason for owning land. So that's pretty shocking when you hear that, is that a lot of people who are owning the forests aren't necessarily primarily motivated by managing it for timber. 50% of those private landowners said that they plan to improve wildlife habitat in the next 5 years. So we have a lot of forests that are owned by private citizens who are interested in producing forests that are healthy for wildlife, for actually doing interventions which are going to help wildlife, and they're not necessarily constrained by timber management. So this is a really great recipe for wildlife work. And we've had a lot of success with a lot of our early successional species programs like golden winged warbler, ruffed grouse, American woodcock programs. And there are a lot of management programs out there and cost share programs to help landowners implement these young forest management techniques. And one of the benefits to young forest management is that when you cut a bunch of trees, you can sell them and make a lot of money. And so it's a little bit easier to convince somebody to create young forest habitat when you can also offer them a $50,000 paycheck. But that same woodland owner survey found that 92% of private landowners wanted their wooded land to remain wooded. So that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But a lot of folks own forests and they want to go for a walk in the woods. They want their forest to feel like a mature forest. So this is a great opportunity for mature forest management. And so putting all this together, this gives us a great opportunity for what I call carbon forestry. So what do I mean by carbon forestry? You've probably heard of things in this realm, but the whole idea of carbon forestry, carbon sequestration forestry, is this overall desire to take carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it into trees. So there's a lot of sources of atmospheric carbon. It could be natural sources like wildfires or the decomposition of trees and stumps, but it could also be the burning of fossil fuels. And forest-based carbon sequestration really focuses on pulling that carbon out of the air and sequestering it into tree trunks and also into forest products such as pulp or timber. Pardon me. There's also recycled carbon products. So this is this concept of producing firewood or pellets, which would offset fossil fuel carbon emissions while heating our homes with carbon that has been pulled out of the atmosphere by plants and then returning it back to the atmosphere. So that's that whole idea of carbon forestry. But the question is, why forests? And a recent study out of 2018 found that natural forest management is actually one of the best natural climate solutions, just behind reforestation, or you might hear the term afforestation. I think it's a terribly confusing term, but afforestation is planting trees. But natural forest management of privately held forests has the second highest maximum mitigation potential in terms of natural climate solutions. And a majority of this potential occurs here in the Northeast. And something I love to remind people of is that wood itself is 50% carbon. So trees do it best. They've been doing it for a long time, and they're going to be a great source to this problem because they're out there sequestering carbon every day. Now, I've been using a lot of terms, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, but these are actually different terms. And it's very important to disambiguate the two. So carbon storage is the amount of carbon that is retained in a carbon pool within a forest. So I have here a few graphs that actually show where carbon is stored in different forest types. And so we may think, okay, carbon is stored in tree trunks and tree leaves, but there are also live below ground carbon stores like roots, mycelium. There are also the soil organic layer. So this is that organic duff where there's a lot of carbon stored. But carbon sequestration is the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So this is removing that carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, resulting in the growth and maintenance of plants and trees. And this is an important distinction to make because the peak sequestration rate occurs at a different time than the peak storage rate in forests. And we can see here, this is a graph of the forest carbon sequestration rate through time following a stand replacing event, whether it be a harvest or a fire. And you can see that the carbon sequestration rate goes down, it's negative for the first 25 years. You have to pardon me, I'm recovering from an illness, but I'm not contagious. And so for the first 25 years, what's actually happening is that when you cut a forest, a lot of that slash is decomposing, a lot of that carbon from the soil organic layer is being released into the air. But then you can see the carbon sequestration rate absolutely takes off. And it hits its peak around anywhere from 30 to 75 years. And that's the peak rate of carbon sequestration. So this is when trees are growing and they're not just putting their growth into leaves, but they're putting their growth into the trunks of the trees, which is going to last for a long time. So young forests really maximize carbon sequestration, whereas your mature forests maximize carbon storage. You can see once you get to about 150 years, the sequestration rate is back to zero. So there's an equal balance of trees dying, releasing carbon, as trees growing and sequestering carbon. And so unmanaged forests, though, may not retain their carbon stores, which is a really important thing to think about. We're going to talk about carbon stock security. So if your forest is storing carbon, is that carbon safe? Passive forest management, so taking a hands-off approach to forests. Carbon storage is asymptotic. So this is getting a little bit complex, but as you go through time, the amount of carbon in a forest levels off. Whereas if you go in and you make these kind of small entries and you remove forest products or some material, what you're doing is you're keeping that forest in that maximum sequestration rate. And so that actually allows that forest to not just store carbon, but to actively keep sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And what you choose to do with the carbon that's removed is really important because that can sequester the carbon even longer. You can have short-lived carbon products like paper, or you can have long-lived carbon products like flooring or furniture. And I included a photo of my 1820s log house, which you heard about. And the logs in my house have long outlived the life of those logs in the forest. So that's a great, I'm living inside of an example of a way that carbon can be stored through forest products. So active forest management is a really important part of this puzzle. Because when you're thinking about storing carbon in a forest, there can be a lot of threats to your carbon sequestration ability of that forest, whether it be invasive species, forest health issues like diseases, or pests, deer browse. As I said, white-tailed deer are really good at limiting that regeneration and browsing our species, but also lack of management can be a big issue. My apologies. So carbon management, forest management for carbon storage sounds like it may align well with forest management for wood thrush breeding habitat. You have the retention of those carbon stores and the light-handed forest interventions, which pair well with that desire to create those canopy gaps that I mentioned before for understory structure. These two concepts can be closely aligned, and if done correctly, we can achieve that multi-use forestry that we're always striving for in forest management. So our mature forests here in Pennsylvania store a huge amount of carbon, as well as provide great breeding habitat for wood thrush. So when we're thinking about carbon techniques for wood thrush habitat, what we really want to do is focus on carbon storage rather than necessarily sequestration. So we want to keep the carbon in those large trees, but we also want to manage for resiliency. We don't want our forests to be one monoculture of the same species of the same age. We really want to have species and structural diversity of our trees so that we can mitigate forest pest outbreaks, forest disease outbreaks, And this is a really great way to incorporate those gaps for wood thrush. And one way of doing this is through what's called a timber stand improvement. So this is a common practice that is done entering a forest. And as I mentioned, taking out those trees that are a little bit less desirable, a little bit less healthy, and then focusing your carbon sequestration in those healthiest trees. You have those big mature oaks that are going to be really great at pumping carbon into their own trunks. And this works really well with the traditional firewood harvest. And that is a kind of a double win in terms of carbon accounting, because when you're thinking about it, if you're pulling firewood out of the woods, you're offsetting your fossil fuel burning in order to heat your home. Another tool in our toolbox for wood thrush habitat management are your carbon offset programs. So at Audubon, we recently completed a project with the American Forest Foundation's Family Forest Carbon Program to try to utilize a carbon program to monetize some of this light-handed forest management for wood thrush habitat. The carbon credit payments that these carbon programs offer landowners can then be turned around to fund some of these light-handed management activities for wood thrush that would otherwise not be commercially viable, while keeping those mature forests in that mature state for those 20-year contracts. And remembering that wood thrush are an umbrella species, as I mentioned before, a lot of other species are going to benefit from these mature forest management techniques. So the retention of those large diameter trees are going to be really important for your cavity and your bark nesting species. Did anyone see any brown creepers this weekend? There we go. 4 people, 5, good. They are really cool because they actually sometimes nest under a little hanging bark, a piece of bark, which I think is a bad decision, but that's what they do. And so having these mature forests can be really important for species like that, and for bark gleaning insects like your nuthatches. But timber stand improvement can create those small canopy gaps to promote structural diversity, which is not just important for the resiliency of the forest, but these small canopy gaps can be occupied by a whole suite of species. Cerulean warbler is another example of a species that responds particularly well to forest gaps in mature forests. And there's a lot of other species that use these gaps for feeding and also for nesting structure. And as I mentioned, carbon programs can be a great way to free up some of that funding for that non-commercial mature forest work that can be sometimes difficult to fund. So with that, the story of wood thrush is yet to be told. We're at an unprecedented time in conservation history here, and we have a chance to make a difference. Fortunately, we know a lot about the habitats of mature forest birds, but we need to put together those puzzle pieces that are going to link the economic solutions together with private landowners in this state. And that's going to be the key for keeping this common bird common and for keeping it in our woodlands for generations to come. And with that, I'll take some questions. Two questions.
Negative effect of other bird habitat. Oftentimes when we're trying to conserve one species.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a really great question. So wood thrush are really interesting because I only spoke about breeding wood thrush habitat. But what we found recently is that wood thrush fledglings do this really cool thing where the second they leave the nest, they make a beeline to high stem density, which is oftentimes young forest. So what we found for what's really good for wood thrush is having that dynamic diversity of forest types on the landscape. So while wood thrush inhabit these mature forests, it's important to not just take the entire landscape and not touch it. So I think that's something that we've run into in the past, is this kind of this motivation of, okay, let's only not take more of a hands-off approach because it's mature breeding habitat. But what we need to remember is, well, wood thrush fledgling habitat is really going to be more your young forest. And kind of a nice dichotomy there is that golden-winged warblers actually do the reverse. So they will breed in those young forest patches and they'll make a beeline into mature forests to feed, and their fledglings will move there too. And that's called patch trading. So that's a really good question. I think that it's important that we don't get stuck in our single species management techniques, but we think about, what are the habitat needs of other birds on the landscape? And that's generally why our Healthy Forest Guide, we recommend that when you think about management, you think from a landscape level. So we shoot anywhere from 10 to 20% of the landscape in young forest, while keep retaining the rest in mature forest. So having that balance of dynamic age classes is really important.
Why don't you take another?
Yeah,
why don't you take another one here? And
Yeah.
I'm going to do some switching.
We got one more.
Speaking of selling to private landowners, do you find it consistent with the objectives of game management, labor management, woodcock, grouse, wild turkey? Does a good sell?
That's a really good question. Yeah, yeah. So we've rolled out a lot of partnerships with the Rough Grouse Society, actually. I mentioned dynamic forest management. There's this concept of a dynamic forest management block, DFRB, and so that is a process that is particularly enjoyed by groups such as NIFWIF or these other funders that are looking at, well, let's not just get in our little silos. Let's see if we can come together and think about what all these species need. And so I've been doing a lot of work with the Rough Grouse Society to approach these areas of landscape that we want to make sure that we have a nice balance of early successional, but also mature forests. And so working with the Rough Grouse Society, we've been able to identify landowners that their property in terms of juxtaposition, we can help them understand, is your property leaning, it would have the best benefit as a young forest or a mature forest. And it's been really nice to be able to see that and then make those management decisions based on what's going on adjacent properties, what's going on maybe the state game lands near your property. And so, yeah, that's been a kind of a really nice sell for landowners, that when we talk to them, they're able to talk to a whole suite of different conservation organizations. And I feel like we've had a kind of a nice dynamic kind of a mixture of habitat types. But yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. And I don't think we have time for one more. Well, thank you very much.